This is a regular webinar series. It's sponsored by the National Association of Scholars. I'm Scott Turner. I'm Director of Science Programs here at the National Association of Scholars, and I'm the regular host for this webinar. I learned a new word recently, thanks to our guest today. The word is ochlocracy. I think I pronounced that correctly, which literally means ruled by the mob or government by a mob. And our guest today, Frances Widdowson, knows something about that, and we'll be discussing that today. Dr. Frances Widdowson is a Canadian political scientist, lately professor in the Department of Economics, Justice, and Policy Studies at Mount Royal University in Calgary. She's since left there. She specializes in academic freedom issues, relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, and the increasingly alarming totalitarian tendencies of identity politics in universities. She's the author of several books on this issue, including, with Albert Howard as co-author, Disrobing the Aboriginal Industry, the Deception Behind Indigenous Cultural Preservation, This was published in 2008. She's also written Separate but Unequal, How Parallelist Ideology Conceals Indigenous Dependency. That came out in 2019. And most recently, she's edited a book entitled Indigenizing the University, Diverse Perspectives. That came out in 2021. For many years, she's been at the burning edge of the ongoing conflicts over academic freedom versus Indigenous ideology. And for her skeptical comments on the, quote, unmarked, unquote, grades controversy at Canadian Indigenous residential schools, allegations that recently have been proven correct, by the way, she's faced an ongoing campaign of harassment, threats, hecklers' vetoes, and cancellations. She has another book in the making, The Woke Academy, How Advocacy Studies Murder Scholarship and Effective Policy Development. And I have to say, I cannot wait to see that book. Before we begin, a little bit of housekeeping. One of the main reasons we do these webinars is to give our audience the opportunity to ask questions of our guest. And we'll be opening up the floor to questions from you, the audience, after about 45 minutes or so. I would just like to invite you to put your questions into the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. And you can put your questions in at any time during our conversation today. In other words, you don't have to wait for the floor to open to ask your questions. Okay, without further ado, welcome, Frances, to this episode of Restoring the Sciences. We're really glad you're here.
Thanks for having me on.
So, you were recently at Mount Royal University in Calgary, and you left there under some rather troubling circumstances. I wonder if you might outline for us what those circumstances were and what the outcome was.
Yes, so my case is currently in arbitration. So it's a very sensitive area of period of time. So I'm going to stay away from any kind of discussion of the case itself. But I was a professor there since 2008. I started in 2008, and it was a wonderful institution. It was just making a transition from the college to the university, and it had a great provost, Robin Fisher, and Dean Manuel Merton, who were very serious academics, and they wanted to make it into an academic university. And it was very collegial. It had all sorts of cross-fertilization across the sciences and the humanities. And then due to kind of circumstances that are happening across universities in Canada, Alberta, I'm very much aware of what's happening in Alberta. It became identity politics started to become more and more prominent. And then in 2020, the totalitarian character, the nature of what people often refer to as wokeism, which is when identity politics becomes totalitarian, really began to manifest itself. And so it basically, the academic character of the institution was destroyed. And this is now, we see this more recently with what's happened at the University of Lethbridge, which is a very, very well documented case now, of which there's a constitutional challenge, a challenge under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, whereby Paul Viminitz, the professor who invited me, Jonah Pickle, who was a student who wanted to hear my talk, and me are, through the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, are suing the University of Lethbridge. And although the courts are not a good area to battle these cultural problems, we're hoping to raise awareness of the terrible state of universities in Alberta and hope to shed some light on what's going on in terms of the restrictions on open inquiry.
So the really surprising thing to me about this, and I think your joint suit with over the Lethbridge controversy is how you've brought a student in to actually be a co-plaintiff in her deprivation of her right to hear opposing points of view. And I wonder if you could tell us some more details about what happened with Lethbridge University, some of the actions that went into this this current lawsuit that you have going, and the event that you were going to be participating in there. Fill us in on some of the timeline and some of the details of that, if you would, please.
Yes, and this is a very interesting case, very, very well documented. And we recently went down to Lethbridge again. I went down, but Jonah Pickle, the student, and Paul Viminitz are actually at the University of Lethbridge. We held a panel at the Lethbridge Public Library, and it was live streamed at the time. There's going to be a video produced, and the live stream can be viewed now on my Facebook page, or the Rational Space Network's Facebook page, which gives a very, very good overview of everything that happened. But just to briefly state the situation, Paul Viminitz invited me to give a talk on how wokeism threatens academic freedom, very ironically. As well, he invited me to give 2 lectures in his philosophy class on should universities foster respect for what's called indigenous ways of knowing, which is a major part of indigenization. When it became known that I was going to be giving this public lecture on wokeism and the threats wokeism poses, it became publicized on social media, and this resulted in a number of elements at the University of Lethbridge lobbying to have the talk canceled. There was the Indigenous Studies Department, which put out a letter denouncing me. A women and gender studies professor by the name of Carolyn Hodes, who's actually written her perspective on the cancellation in a journal called Feminist Asylum, of all names. The vice provost students sent out an email, a mass email to all of Paul Viminitz's students saying that they could excuse themselves from the in-class lectures if they felt they were going to be harmed by my lectures. Anyway, so the president initially stood firm because we have the Chicago principles instituted at the University of Lethbridge, and said that although he found my views to be abhorrent, the free speech policy at the University of Lethbridge meant that the talk would need to go ahead. And there was a counter talk that was organized and all sorts of things, but things seemed fine. And then a couple of days before the talk was going to happen, he backtracked and canceled the talk, which was a complete shock because he just stated how it would have to go ahead because of the free speech policy that was in place. And then a petition had been started by students and also a representative of the Students Association, an Indigenous member, a number of faculty members supported the cancellation of the talk. And most alarming, when I was going to give a Zoom talk that evening, a professor contacted me and said that a number of professors had told him that they didn't even want to contact me for the Zoom link because they were afraid that it would be known that they were requesting a Zoom link to listen to the talk. And I told Paul Viminitz as well, I thought it was very important that I should show up at the university to give my talk in a speaker's format at the university, so that I wouldn't be pushed out by what I considered to be highly inappropriate actions by the president. 700 people were there when I showed up, and not all of them were opposed to me speaking. There were about 100 people who just refused to let me speak at all. And then that evening, after I wasn't able to talk and I had to be basically escorted off because the security was becoming nervous, I didn't feel threatened personally. I thought it was a bit theatrical. The president put out another notice congratulating the people who had shut down my talk. So what the president did is just an absolutely outrageous violation of any sort of academic principles that the University of Lethbridge might have had. So it's a very disturbing case. And, this is going to be, investigated in much more detail over the next couple of years.
So what was the pressures that caused him to capitulate? I mean, he initially took, I thought, a very brave stand. What happened? Why did he capitulate?
Well, I think it was largely the student union, because University of Lethbridge has really put forward an image that it supports the indigenization process. Carolyn Hodes claimed in her article that she had alerted the president to the donors who gave money because of indigenization to the university. So she herself takes credit for the cancellation herself to some extent. The Indigenous Studies Department, which is a big, very, very powerful entity at the University of Lethbridge. The Faculty Association, that was the other shocking, very, very shocking thing, because in Canada, protection of academic freedom falls often to faculty associations upholding those clauses in the collective agreement. In a shocking statement that the Faculty Association made, they said, made all sorts of references to hurtful speech and trying to help people through the trauma that they would be experiencing and so on. Fortunately, the Faculty Association is taking forward Paul Viminitz's grievance that his academic freedom was violated because he was denied space to allow me to give the talk. So they are doing that. But the fact that they sent out that statement gave the administration encouragement to cancel the talk because the administration knew the Faculty Association wasn't really going to be opposed to that happening. So that was a very, very sort of particularly troubling development that happened. So those are sort of the forces, I think, that were at work.
Yeah. I mean, the shocking thing, and this is a common thing that we see in a lot of these kinds of cancellation campaigns, is that in many cases you have an overweening administrative power that's doing this, but the really shocking thing is the lack of support of colleagues for these basic principles. And I've always kind of said that, what academic freedom is not only meant to protect you from your administration, but also to protect you from your colleagues who can actually be particularly vicious when it comes to, driving out the foreign virus, if you will, of free thought. And how did we translate from that state of academic freedom where faculty valued it to the utmost to where they're actually the worst enemies of academic freedom? How do we get there?
Yes, it's been a cultural change in universities starting in the 60s, actually. Like that's the roots of it, is the 60s. What happened is postmodernism, which is a sort of a reactionary force in opposition to the principles of the Enlightenment, which claims that there's no such thing as an objective truth, searching for an objective truth, and it's really subjectivity which should take precedence over objectivity. That kind of stance in the late 1960s, which developed, allowed these advocacy studies programs to gain a foothold in universities. So it began with Black studies and ethnic studies, and then you had women's studies following, and then disability studies, and now the most advocacy oriented of all queer studies programs. And these programs are driven by identity politics and have no academic character at all. They're completely activist. And they had a very marginal position within the academy to begin with. So they got a foothold, which was a mistake. They should never have been allowed to enter into universities. But people sort of said, well, what's the harm? They're just a minor kind of area. And there's all sorts of other areas in the university where you can get an actual, sort of academic education. But then starting in the 2000s, they began to sort of develop alliances with administrators. And then the university corporatization that was becoming more and more prominent saw these activists as a useful tool to try to sort of force faculty to see the brand of the university as the most important thing. So rather than being an independent voice who is exercising skepticism and so on, universities really use these activists to assert their control over their brand. And now with these diversity, inclusion, and equity offices everywhere, pretty much this identity politics has taken over the machinery of the university. And really in the late 2020, around that time, pretty much the takeover was complete. And now professors are very fearful, very, very fearful to state anything that goes against sort of this brand management that's happening within universities.
Yes, I mean, you can see the spread of it, and you can see the origins of it in the whole postmodernist idea, but it still takes money to do this. And you made a point of pointing out that that the spread of this is facilitated by a fairly well-known phenomenon, namely rent seeking. And would you mind telling us what you mean by how rent seeking actually promotes the spread of this ideology? And I suppose we should start with the definition of what rent seeking actually is. What is it?
So rent seeking is when you use a particular characteristic to that's not essential for the task at hand, to divert resources to particular groups. So it doesn't have a functional part. Like everyone needs resources. So you can see this in terms of professors, is that everyone is concerned, obviously, that their salary or their grants or these sorts of things. This is normal part of the institution. What happens with rent seeking, however, is that you use non-academic types of elements to then make a demand for these resources. And there was a really good piece actually in the National Association of Scholars publication, Academic Questions. I think it was about 20 years ago, and it was by a person by the last name of Kamenyi, who argued that these advocacy studies programs are rent-seeking programs, and what they do is they create barriers to entry. So, and you can see this with targeting and affirmative action kinds of policies of various kinds. It's not your academic background and merit that determines whether you get a position. It's your identity. So that's the first thing, putting in barriers to entry done either through your identity or the kind of position that you have that makes it so it's an activist position. So if you're going to be critical of, critical race theory or something like that, you won't get the position because critical race theory is seen as the as the actual determining ideology of the program. And then, interestingly, with respect to the involvement of administration, it's what's called tying. So programs are tied to activist goals. So it's not just academic matters and increasing knowledge that is prized by these programs. It is the fact that they satisfy various activist kinds of pressures. So they're able to respond to those. And this means that resources that should be going to the academic mandate of the university are diverted to these advocacy studies programs because of the sort of the pandering to identity politics that is occurring in the universities, which has become much more prominent recently. And it's a wider social goal that you see, and governments are involved in funding universities on this basis. So, and this is about increasing the numbers of women or Indigenous people. You'll get more resources from the government if that becomes one of your the goals of your institution. So there's all these ways which are diverting funds away from the academic type of ethos of the university and diverting those funds into more activist types of approaches.
Yeah. We see the similar kind of thing going on in the sciences. There's an increasing emphasis on identity politics there as well, but there's this additional issue of government basically funding politically favored science programs like climate change and those kinds of things. And of course, rent seeking doesn't work if there's no stream of revenue to skim to begin with. And this raises kind of a chicken and egg issue, doesn't it? Because, we can clearly trace back the rise of postmodernism to the 60s, as you described. But what is it that fueled the increase of resources that you can skim? Was it increasing political power of activists within universities, or were they just responding rationally to opportunities provided by government, basically saying, well, we're going to give lots of money to universities, and then administrators look and say, well, where's the revenue stream coming from, and therefore I'm going to promote that. Do you have any thoughts on sort of which came first in that? Was it the activists, or was it the money that was being poured into universities?
This is a huge question, and it's one that I've been developing, as part of my theoretical background to the manuscript that I've been developing. To some extent, it's connected to wider social forces of identity politics more generally. So there's identity politics in the university, which is very, very strong, but then there's identity politics in the wider society, and you see this in banks is the best kind of example. If you go into your local bank, at least in Canada, you'll see, LGBTQ types of propaganda in the bank. You'll see a territorial land acknowledgement, these sorts of things. And this has kind of had it was percolating throughout society in the 1960s, which was largely a diversion away from class politics, which can be seen objectively in terms of the immiseration of the working class, these kinds of social forces, a diversion from that into the encouragement of subjective identities. And so women's politics and the civil rights movement, which was had great laudable goals in the 1960s, which was basically anti-discrimination types of legislation and programs, got kind of flipped to become, giving privileges to various, sort of members of various groups. So from anti-discrimination to affirmative action programs. And this has been increasing generally within society. And we shouldn't be surprised then if you see the same kind of tendencies that exist in universities. And as well, it's been mentioned that universities as sort of bastions of Enlightenment values, that's been a very recent phenomenon. Like that hasn't been around in universities very long. So we shouldn't really be surprised that it's not that that it's not really all that entrenched. Universities often served a number of other purposes, and the purpose now is to pursue what is called social justice, which I don't really think is actually, there's nothing wrong with pursuing social justice. It's just, do things like indigenization and trans activism and all these things. Is that really something that is creating a better world for people in society? That's a question that I would say, I think it's having terrible consequences. So I think there are social changes that are happening, and then the universities, to some extent, because they're part of society, are absorbing those kinds of changes that are happening.
Yeah. This is a longstanding question. The trends that you outline are pretty well established. The origins of postmodernism, and I, of course, was in graduate school I was in college in the 1970s, and saw some of this with the rise of Science for the People and those kinds of groups. So it's been there for forever. And it's evident to all who look at it that it's pretty firmly entrenched now in universities, to the detriment of, I think, the real mission of the university, which is actually to provide an independent outlook on things, so that society can then judge, based upon those discussions, what the right way to go is. But somehow, either the universities are lost entirely, or we have to be able to recover them somehow. And how do you do that?
You have to change the culture. You have to change the culture. So the mistake I think we make sometimes is thinking that it can be changed through legislative action or government kind of intervention, which is tempting to do because the institutions are failing. But unless you have the professors, especially, on board, it's going to be subverted. So my own view is, I think it would be very helpful to have a public inquiry. So have like an open airing of some of the problems which exist, which can only really be done by giving people immunity. And I have called upon the Alberta government to hold an open inquiry into what's happening at universities in Alberta, which would be very helpful. The second thing is to organize, and professors are not very good at this because we're so used to our own individual research projects, and sometimes we do collaborate with others, but in terms of political organizing, it's not our strong suit. And in Canada, we have an organization called the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship, which is basically a sister organization to the National Association of Scholars. And something that some of my colleagues have done is that they've started local chapters in various universities. And right now, that's kind of going to be my focus for the next couple of years, is starting local chapters of the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship in Alberta, specifically Southern Alberta, which would be University of Lethbridge, Lethbridge College, Medicine Hat College, and Red Crow College, and developing a kind of sort of organizational base where you can sort of put out sort of a monthly or a publication, just kind of giving sort of various thoughts on what's happening in those institutions, and how those how the local chapters can hook up to the national organization, and then developing linkages between the national organization and international organizations such as the National Association of Scholars. The Free Speech Union is another very, very important organization in the UK. FIRE is a very, very important organization in the United States. So we have to develop organizational strength so that professors who feel that the academic character of the institution is important have a support network that they can rely upon. And as well, sort of socializing professors to sort of see the danger signs of various things, because that's one of the big problems of things like wokeism, or a specific aspect of wokeism, which is indigenization, is that it's promoted on the grounds that it's helpful. It's a helpful direction for marginalized and oppressed groups. And that's why people accept it, when it's actually hugely detrimental to oppressed groups, because members of oppressed groups, more than any other person in society, needs to understand the roots of their oppression. And because postmodernism denies the search for truth and the development of some kind of universal knowledge, it really prevents those members of groups from understanding their circumstances and allows them to be victimized by these rent-seeking elements, either in society or within universities. So I think organization is one of the most important things that has to be undertaken to take back our universities and stop them from being destroyed in the way that they currently are.
There was an article recently where I'd like to circle back to Mount Royal University for a moment, and there was a very interesting article that came out in the National Post of Canada a couple days ago. It was a report on a survey from the Angus Reid Institute, and they outlined what they described as a sort of a taxonomy of the political ecosystem, and they basically divided people into 5 categories. There was a fairly small group of what they called zealous activists, a larger group of, but still small group of what they call quiet accommodators, and this included, people in middle management and those sort of things. The conflicted middle was a third category where, people say, okay, well, that's reasonable, but maybe there's these other kinds of things that I'm not sure where to go. The fourth category was frustrated skeptics, people who saw things clearly, but they were frustrated at their inability to actually change things. And so they just, as you say, keep their heads down and hope that retirement comes before the mobs come for them. And then the fifth category is defiant objectors. And I think that you fit pretty clearly into the last one. I mean, you have been standing up for these principles for many, many years now, and doing so in the face of a considerable amount of harassment, threats, and intimidation. So we spoke a little bit earlier about how faculty are not really stepping up to defend these principles, and I'm very interested in some general your general impressions about Mount Royal University. Now, Mount Royal University, they describe themselves as serving local Indigenous cultures. On their website, for example, they got a whole program that's going on starting today that they call the Truth, Reconciliation, and Decolonization exercise. They've developed what they call an Indigenous mentorship program, where Indigenous people can only be mentored in particular ways, or perhaps by particular classes of people. So this seems to be the mission of Mount Royal University. And of course, the question is, where do the faculty of Mount Royal University fit into this political ecosystem that was outlined in the National Post? And I'm specifically interested to know your colleagues. Where did they mostly fit? Frustrated skeptics, conflicted middle, zealous activists. What was your experience with them? Because they clearly, well, I don't think you enjoyed the support that you should have got from your colleagues. So could you tell us a little something about how your colleagues at Mount Royal University responded to some of the threats that you were facing, if you can?
Yeah, so actually, my colleagues are much more supportive at Mount Royal than I've seen other cases in Canada. Okay. So I have a lot of support And I go to the university and drink beer on Friday nights quite often with my colleagues there. However, to be vocal about it is difficult. Actually, I think it was 2019 because I started a group there called the Rational Space Network, which actually still is in existence. It's just because I'm not there right now, it's kind of in hiatus. We held what was called the Critical Thinking Series, where we had a number of events on contentious issues and tried to model for students and the public how you could discuss a contentious question like, does trans activism negatively impact women's rights? And we had Megan Murphy, who's a person who's critical of trans activism, and Julie Ray Goldstein, who was a trans activist. And it was a very heated discussion that happened, but it actually took place. And as far as I know, it's the only event of its kind that's ever been held at a university. And so I thought for a while that it's possible that Mount Royal could become the free speech, kind of a free speech university. And I still have hopes that that's possible. So I think there's a lot of support, but if you are going to be vocal, you have a sense that you're certainly not going to be a career enhancing move. So at the very least, it's going to mean that you're going to have difficulty getting the kinds of benefits that if you were a promoter of indigenization, for example, that you'd become celebrated and you'd get your picture up and you'd have the administration, saying what a wonderful professor you are. Whereas if you're going to be critical of it, people are not going to be very friendly, the activist element. So I really see that there is, about 10% on either side, people who are zealots, as I said, and then the 10% of people who will actually put their name on something and sign something, which is very difficult to get people to do. And then there's kind of a spectrum in the middle of, some people are just giving up and they don't want to have anything to do with it anymore. They just come and teach their courses and go home. And then various forms of opportunism, which I find is the most distressing kinds of aspect of it. Is I sort of respect the activists sometimes, like they're true believers, they have principles, but the opportunists are the most alarming of all of them, because they'll just do whatever will benefit them. And you can't even enter into any kind of conversations with people who are opportunistic.
Do you think those opportunists are increasing in the university or steady, or do you think they're on the wane?
They will be increasing. Well, the funds follow the money.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah.
They'll be increasing until we get sort of some kind of traction in terms of pushing back against it. Then they'll follow whatever the winds of change are. So they are, and some are very, very almost have psychopathic personalities. They'll do whatever, they'll go after you just because they'll see that that's going to be beneficial for them to go after you.
Yeah, I've had conversations with a lot of colleagues, not just in the United States, but also you in Canada. I have good friends in Israel who have described this very same thing. It's that the level of true collegiality, as opposed to just being polite to one another as they stab you in the back, is really on the wane. And part of it is I think the loss of how shall I say this? Loss of confidence in what the mission of the academy is supposed to be. There's a philosopher, Benedict Beckel. I don't know if you know his name, but he argues that, well, this kind of self-loathing of basic principles is widespread through our society right now, but it's not a rare phenomenon. Civilizations come and go, and one of the reasons behind their decline is what he calls oikophobia, that is fear of one's own house. And That kind of thing is happening in the sciences as well. You see an increased level of self-loathing of really the greatest achievements of the scientific mind. And you see it in cancellation campaigns against prominent scientists, living and dead. James Watson was dragged over the coals. There was recent attempts to cancel Thomas Huxley and Charles Darwin from British universities, and so is the solution just political and organizing, or do you think we're actually in the realm of oikophobia right now, which is a broader civilizational problem that really there's not a lot that we can do to reverse?
Well, I think it is a civilizational problem. Postmodernism, it is basically a decline, the decadence, the narcissism, these kinds of indicators of a society in decline. And we need a renaissance. And that's an interesting question of how do renaissances happen? Part of it, one important feature is recognition of the problem. So I think there's a lot of people sleepwalking through the situation. I still hear people say things like, there's no such thing as cancel culture, and this is just an event. This is an invention of right-wing, kinds of tactics and so on. And I think to myself, where are these people? Where are they, in a cave somewhere? Like, do they? But it's, of course, it's a defense mechanism, because they don't. If they recognize the problem, then they would feel obligated to do something about it if they were principled. And so it's easier just to kind of, turn the other way and think it's just kind of a passing phase and so on. So I think capitalism is in its decline. There's serious problems with the economic and political system, and the culture is a reflection of that. And we need to seriously think about the things that we value. And I was just mentioning, I forgot to say this, I think there is a serious attack on the merit principle generally. And I think postmodernism and these aspects are part of that, where you just don't have that, you don't have those structures in place to ensure a high quality of production. It's all, junk and declining, and people are just, trying to grab whatever resources that they can. So trying to think about the kinds of socialization processes that are needed to have these high standards is something which has to occur. And that's not easy in a circumstance where you have a kind of a society in decline.
Yeah, and one wonders where that pushback is going to come from, and there've been some recent incidents that have shown up where the major pushback is coming from some fairly young high school students. I mean, there was an incident recently where there was a publicized walkout of students from their classes when their administration tried to say that no, men can go into girls' bathrooms and whatnot. So one hopes that teenage rebellion will come to our rescue in the right way this time. So, but that's many, many years in the future, of course. So what's next on your agenda? What's your next couple of years going to look like?
Well, I've got my arbitration process, which is going on for the next, I guess, 6 months. So that's a big part of my life. Which is difficult, but at the same time, it's also good in the sense that we'll finally have hopefully a decision about the matter that then can be discussed. I have the Lethbridge Charter Challenge, which focuses on a lot of that is going to be part of the indigenization, some of the difficulties of indigenization, which is evidenced by all the reaction that happened, which had to do with the unmarked graves and being able to
Mhm.
talk about residential schools and so on. I am involved extensively in writing on the residential schools and this the kind of discovery, what was called the discovery of quote unquote unmarked graves in Canada. The Kamloops case is one of the most important, where it was stated in May 2021 that the remains of 215 children have been found. It turns out that there is no evidence of that at all, and it was just ground penetrating radar anomalies, which are likely due to septic tiles that were laid at the site in the 1920s. And not one parent has said that their a child never came home from the Kamloops Indian Residential School. So if there are 215 bodies that are buried there in this apple orchard, who would that be? Like, it doesn't make any sense. So I'm working with a research group of about 20 people trying to have some more evidence-based discussion of
Mhm.
the residential schools and the unmarked graves issue in particular. And then finally, I've got the local chapters that I am the Charter Challenge over the next couple of years, doing talks on academic freedom in Alberta, trying to get more attention paid to the problems, and then the organization of various local chapters of the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship to begin with in Southern Alberta, and then to use that as a template for Central Alberta and Northern Alberta.
Okay. I saw on I think one of your blogs, or maybe it's Connection Space. I think you have a book in the making, the Woke Academy. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so that is covering some of the same ground that we were talking about at the beginning, which is trying to understand how the Woke Academy came into existence. And this kind of developments that happened in the 1960s. And the book is sort of the beginning of it. The first part of it kind of looks at the historical development of advocacy studies programs, and then as well the economic reasons for why those programs came into existence, and then looking at the specific advocacy studies programs. So these advocacy studies programs can be seen on a spectrum. You could potentially have a department of women's studies that was a completely academic department. So it's not to say that women shouldn't be studied and it's not an important area of investigation. It's an advocacy studies program when it insists upon a particular identity politics activist position. So about patriarchy, or this whole standpoint epistemology kind of thing, where women have a particular way of knowing, and if a man says something, he shouldn't be allowed to speak because men obviously cannot study anything to do with women, and so on and so forth. So there's sort of the ethnic studies areas, which would be Black studies and Indigenous studies. That's kind of one area, which is looking at, sort of the relationship between race and culture and all the activism behind these kinds of questions. And then what's called the politics of the body. So that would be women's studies and disability studies and queer studies. So queer studies now is the most activist of all the advocacy studies programs. And you can tell from the title, right? Because you wouldn't call women's studies, chick studies or something like that. Like, if you have a title like that, it's just an indication that it's not serious in terms of its academic content. So I'm looking at each of those advocacy studies areas in turn, about how they came into existence, the particular kind of advocacy character of each one of those programs, and then the negative impact that that's having on research in that particular area. And as well, universities are very, very important in terms of the knowledge that is developed, because that knowledge then becomes the basis for policy development of various kinds. So there's quite negative consequences that these advocacy studies programs are having for the development of various public policies, at least in the Canadian case, which is going to be most of the focus. But United States is also very important in this regard in terms of the impact that it's having.
Yeah. I see a lot of things are coming into the chat and the Q&A. So why don't we transition to answering some of these questions. Alison Charba asks, would you elaborate on the recent resolution of the unmarked grave story? What ultimately happened? You've kind of elaborated on that. Alison, let me ask if what we have said has addressed your question. But Frances, do you have anything to add to what you mentioned earlier?
Yeah. So this was I wrote a piece on the Kamloops case, two pieces actually, in a publication called The American Conservative. One is called Billy Remembers, comparing it to the satanic panic that happened in the 1980s in the United States, and Relative Truths and Rent Seeking is the kind of follow-up piece on that. That has a particular focus on the Kamloops case. The Kamloops case is the most important because that's what started the whole hysteria going, is the kind of the press release that was put out saying that the remains of 215 children have been found, which was not true at all. And we cannot, no matter how hard we try to correct that, there's a very, very good researcher, phenomenal researcher in Canada, whose name is Nina Green, who's done huge amounts of research on this area. Her website is called Residential School Records, and she's done an investigation of a whole bunch of these different areas. So the Kamloops case started it off, but it kind of spread to all sorts of other areas. And what happened is two things. The first one is that there was a confusion of the ground penetrating radar anomalies being found with the idea that there must be bodies there. So just because you have an anomaly in ground penetrating radar, you don't have any ability to see what's there. So it could be rocks, it could be soil disturbances of various kinds. So that was the first kind of confusion that was seized upon. The second one is the cemeteries, unmarked graves in cemeteries. So there's a whole bunch of cemeteries in Canada where the graves were originally marked with wooden crosses, but those crosses have deteriorated. And so what happens is that these activists use the fact that you have a lot of unmarked graves, which were marked, which is not, there's nothing sinister about them or clandestine about them, and the fact that there are large numbers of unmarked graves, to insinuate that this must mean that there's some kind of foul play that has happened, or some kind of clandestine burial that's going on. So trying to sort of expose those fallacies is part of the project. And as well, there's been a number of excavations that have been undertaken which have not found any evidence of burials. The most recent was 14 supposed unmarked graves in a church basement in Pine Creek, and that was found to be nothing. And then McGill, there's a current controversy going on at McGill now, where they're trying to build, they have some construction site and that's been shut down. And although they found no unmarked graves there, burials there at all, there's still activists who are holding out, who are stopping the construction from occurring. So in each case where there's been excavations of these anomalies, there's been no remains that have been found. So it's basically been a fabrication. And it's not to say people are lying, because there's a lot of people have these memories of things which are not accurate, or could have been sort of colored through their emotional circumstances. But just because an indigenous, what's called an indigenous knowledge keeper, has some kind of memory of something, that does not mean that that's real. That has to be substantiated through some other kinds of evidence. And as well, I should mention, there's a defrocked United Church minister whose name is Kevin Annett, who's been telling these kinds of tales since, I believe, the 1990s. And his lurid tales have had a tremendous impact on a number of Indigenous communities, which have kind of absorbed his highly improbable types of claims that he's put out. So what we really want to see is excavations at Kamloops. There was a Fifth Estate program, a CBC investigative journalism program that was aired in January 2022. Manny Jules, who was the former chief of that band, said that the heads of the families had agreed that excavations should take place. So far, we're over a year and a half after that promise was made. We still have not had any excavations at Kamloops. And the ground penetrating radar report, which was done by Sarah Beaulieu, has been kept secret by the band and has not been released. And the lawyer for the band even threatened the archaeology department at Simon Fraser University, put that archaeology department under a gag order, saying that that archaeology department cannot discuss anything to do with the unmarked graves at Kamloops. So we need public accountability from the Kamloops case, because the band made this claim. As a result of that, there was a hysteria that swept across Canada. I think 60 churches in Canada were subjected to arson attacks because of that claim. And the ground penetrating radar was in fact funded by the government. So there should be accountability. And the only way we can have accountability is to have excavations done at that site.
My memory may be incorrect here, and please correct me, but I thought that there was actually one case where local tribes actually did the excavations and found nothing. Am I incorrect in that, or is that the case that you just mentioned, where a group agreed but then hasn't
Been
followed
about
through?
7, I think, excavations. I'm not sure about the local, but
Okay.
all in whomever did the excavations, in all cases, sometime, there was a case in I think it's Shubenacadie in Nova Scotia. They did find burials, but the burials were of settlers. They were non-Indigenous burials. So that was the one case I knew where there was actually a result that was found.
Okay. All right. Paul asks, and I think we've kind of covered this. He says there was a time when intellectually honest scholars understood that failure to rigorously seek for evidence and arguments which contradicted their theses was a sign of incompetence, failure to do so, and refusal to do so was a sign of corruption. And he asked, do you see any possibility of academia returning to these standards of academic integrity? And if so, what can we do to help bring them back? And you mentioned scholars need to wake up, they need to speak up, they need to act against these kinds of trends. But do you have anything that you'd like to add to those comments that you made a little while ago?
So the first one is recognition of the problem. So if we could get people to recognize the problem, then we can sort of start thinking about this, the solution to the problem. The secondly is exposing wokeism or identity politics that has become totalitarian for the sort of self-serving, rent-seeking type of process that it is. It's not helpful at all to members of these groups. Indigenous people is a very good example of this. So in terms of the indigenization process, this is being sold as being very helpful to Indigenous people. That's why we should do it, is that everyone understands that Indigenous people have suffered terrible circumstances throughout history. There's been terrible things that have been done. I think most people that I talk to would agree with that and would be totally open to doing things to address the problems. But providing a lower standard of education to Indigenous students is not going to be something that addresses these problems. And that's what's happening with indigenization, is that indigenization, which is about, incorporating these what's called indigenous ways of knowing into the curriculum. This is going to be for courses that indigenous people take, right? Because it's not going to be non-indigenous people who are going to want to take those courses. But these indigenous ways of knowing are anti-scientific. So people who would be very upset, for example, about creationism being taught in a biology class, justifiably so, are on board with teaching creationism in an indigenous studies class, not to study the creationism, but to actually have creationism taken seriously as a way of explaining the world. And you see this with the prayers that happen at universities too, is that if you had any non-indigenous person giving a prayer at some kind of public event or at the beginning of a talk, everyone would be very upset about that. But in the case of when it's an indigenous elder who's brought in, there's sort of active promotion of this. And if you sort of raise objections to these prayers being held, then you're seen as being an anti-indigenous person and someone who doesn't care about indigenous people. So I think this is one of the big obstacles, is that wokeism has painted itself and people who are promoting indigenization as they're the good people who are doing this, when in fact, they are not only the destroyers of the institution, they are actually having a very, very negative impact on the ability of marginalized peoples to be able to, for society to be able to address the root causes of that marginalization.
Yeah. Heather McDonald, of course, has made some of the same points for minority cultures in the United States. It is doing no one any favors, but, you have this, I think the biggest problem that's facing marginalized communities is not the level of talent or willingness to work or any of these kinds of things. What the big problem you have is an overwhelming, how shall I describe this, liberal solicitude, where you say that, where you basically are holding these people in silent contempt, and many of the programs that you're are proposing actually diminish the value of those individuals. And this raises kind of an interesting question. Have you had Native American people reach out to you and indicate that they really think that you're right?
There's a few who have,
Mm-hmm.
who I very much enjoy talking to them, or certainly appreciate my honesty about it. The public one is Lloyd Robertson,
Mm-hmm.
who is part of the humanist community. So he's very disturbed about, sort of seeing indigenous people as being naturally spiritual or having spiritual beliefs. And that was always kind of alarming to me, that, there's kind of the assumption made that if you're an indigenous person, you must be someone who prays, and you must have, why can't you be an atheist if you're an indigenous person, or have some other religious beliefs? Like, why is there this kind of insistence that that's the case? So, but I think it's a big, huge difficulty, because for indigenous people, there's huge encouragement to see yourself as part of a tribal entity. And if you go against that, you can suffer very serious consequences. Like, it's bad enough for people who are, sort of well integrated into society. And myself, for example, I'm not very popular, but I don't have to suffer, from a large kind of extended tribal network that's going to punish me in various ways for being critical of the existing system. And, there's a lot of money that's at stake here. And if you start criticizing what I call the neo-tribal elites, which are not the ordinary indigenous people. So that's what people don't really understand, is that the Indigenous spokesperson who you hear talking about things, that's not the ordinary Indigenous person in an Indigenous community, yet they're sort of taken as being representative of the entire population. But for those ordinary Indigenous people who are reliant upon housing, jobs, all sorts of whatever they need for survival, and find it very difficult to leave that Indigenous community, it's going to be very difficult for them to be critical of the existing system that is unfolding.
Yeah. Okay, back to the Q&A momentarily. Bob Moranto asked an interesting question. Are Canadian universities run from the province or from the national government in Ottawa? And he goes on to say, I would think Alberta would be open to free thought, which sort of fits into our presumption here in the United States that the Western states are these habitats of rugged individualism and diversity of thought. And of course, this doesn't really address this taxonomy of political activism, which is the people who are the dedicated activists are actually a fairly small minority within the general population. So building on the last question, obviously academics have been quite hostile to you, but what kinds of support do you get from just general ordinary Albertans or Canadians? Do you find a lot of support there?
Oh, yes, a lot of support. And the government is a real puzzle in Alberta, because, as I said, I'm calling on the Alberta government. When I was counseled at the University of Lethbridge, they did basically nothing. And they put out this mealy-mouthed statement saying that now they're going to have some kind of checklist that they were going to get universities to do. But the people who are going to be doing the checklist are, part of the problem which exists in universities. And I was sort of thinking to myself, why wouldn't the government, since they did direct universities to have the Chicago principles put in place, why wouldn't they then stand up and say, hey, we had this directive and you have just flagrantly violated it. Here's some consequences for what you've done. And I think it's kind of one of the disturbing things about conservative governments is that they're hostile to public education. So, and I heard James Lindsay, for people who know James Lindsay, who I think James Lindsay has some important things to say about the current situation. But one thing I disagree with him about is he was saying, what do you do to deal with wokeism? You give it more weight. So you encourage it. So, you've got this woman who's a women and gender studies professor at the University of Lethbridge, whose name is Carolyn Hodes, who's one of the most irrational people I've ever seen write in a supposedly academic journal. If you were James Lindsay, you would encourage her because her running around with all her ridiculous ideas just, shows wokeism for the idiocy that it is. And then that justifies the yanking of public funding from universities. And that's kind of the end game of many conservative governments. So they're probably in some way very happy about wokeism because it's embarrassing the public educational system, and that will justify the removal of funding. And for someone like me, who is very much a supporter of public education, public education allows working class people to go for the first time in history to universities to learn about the world. Anyone can go to a university and take courses and improve their understanding of the world. What we are seeing now is that public educational system is seriously under threat and is probably going to be destroyed. And that will mean that all sorts of working class people will have no hope of being able to, understand the world that they could have if that public education system was intact. So, for people who are on the left of the political spectrum, wokeism is your enemy and you should be fighting against it because it is making universities into laughing stocks. And we can have working class politics, we can have left-wing politics, but in order to have that to be a viable kind of political entity, we need reason, we need evidence, we need logic, we need science. That is very, very important for left-wing politics. And we are seeing that being destroyed by this current ridiculous, sort of identity politics direction that everything has been taken in.
Yeah, it's reminiscent of something that Glenn Reynolds, Instapundit, is fond of saying, is that the major virtue of free speech is it helps the fools to self-identify, and that's kind of the rationale behind actually publicizing wokeism.
Yes.
Give them free reign, but then that has to be followed through with some kind of political pressure on legislatures to say, look, don't rise to the bait here. There's certain value to higher education, including to the people who are supposedly marginalized and oppressed, and that their way out of that is having a robust educational system. But of course, to do that, it either has to come from the general public or it has to come from rational faculty in universities. And I want to make sure I heard you correctly here. You said that the Alberta government actually insisted that public universities adopt the Chicago principles. Is that right?
Yes,
That's
that happened in 2019.
Okay.
And there's a directive. And so all universities had to develop policies on it, which they did. And the University of Lethbridge was one of them. Mount Royal University again, every university was, but they were never the woke activists, professors were never on. They resisted it because they claimed that free speech is a ploy by the right wing elements to have hate speech be brought into the universities. These sorts of things. This is the kind of arguments that were being made. And throughout 2019, I tried to get my colleagues to, have forums and so on to discuss this so we could kind of get to the bottom of it. We did actually have a panel that we held at Mount Royal in 2019 on whether we should have the Chicago principles brought in. And, but none of the woke wanted to participate in the discussions about it. So unfortunately.
Are they being honored? Yeah. Are they being honored mostly in the breach?
Are they being honored?
Mostly in the breach.
The Chicago principles?
Yeah, I mean, despite having those principles in place, you had a bad experience with Mount Royal University, and you're having it now. So is it fair to say that despite these mandates to adopt the Chicago principles, the faculty aren't really going along with it?
No, they're not at all. And they subvert it. This is the problem with trying to address cultural problems with legislative mechanisms, because it's just, and that's the other problem with wokeism, is that it's not seen as an ideology. It's seen as just being a good person. So, and this is really not understanding the nature of the authoritarianism that is kind of the large part of the story. And you need professors, and the same with administrators too, is that administrators are just trying to run a quiet ship here. That's generally what they want, is they don't want people fighting all the time. And so if all they hear from are the woke activists, then they're going to defer to them. And this is especially alarming with the unions, because the unions and the administrators spend a lot of time trying to, negotiate things and so on. And if the union has been taken over and captured, then you have no protections of any kind of free speech type of principles at the university. And this is basically what's happening now across Canada. But I know the Alberta case very well, and all the unions are like in my case, no union. Well, the Canadian Association of University Teachers is really the one, steadfast element. So the Canadian Association of University Teachers is the union that represents all the unions, and they still are very protective of academic freedom. And they actually sent out a notice to the University of Lethbridge saying this was wrong, that they had canceled my talk. But all the other unions in Alberta or across Canada never said anything about it at all. And the University of Lethbridge Faculty Association had this horrible statement where it was talking about, hurtful speech and all sorts of supports that would be available for people who felt that they had been harmed, and that kind of language of safetyism, which is very prominent in universities.
Yeah. Okay. Blake McLeod poses an interesting question. It's related to something that we're pursuing here at National Association of Scholars. One of my colleagues, Ian Oxnevad, has been looking at the intrusion of Chinese political players into universities through Confucius Institutes and other things. And Blake asks if you have seen or heard any indications that malignant foreign or political actors are manipulating within this cohort to influence our politics through social division. To what extent can we approach this as a foreign threat?
I don't know very much about that. I know I've heard disturbing things about the Chinese government. I've heard, in fact, about the whole genocide, accusations of Canada being a genocidal country. I've heard that various countries like China have been involved in sort of fomenting that to kind of take pressure off their own sort of accusations that they've been facing about their treatment of various minority groups. But unfortunately, I don't know very much about that. I think with foreign students, though, there's probably quite a lot of influence. That's one of the big problems I do know is a lot of the money now that universities are getting in from tuition, the tuition of foreign students. And that's possibly one area that's having a big impact on the nature of universities.
Yeah. Another question from Blake McLeod. He's wondering if anyone is suggesting that these apple orchard burials might have included terminated pregnancies, fetuses that were aborted prematurely.
There are stories about this. So this is one of the kind of lurid stories that are going around. And I think it has to do with Catholic opposition to abortion. I think it's wound up with that. But one of the main kind of stories is of fetuses being thrown into furnaces. That's a major kind of story that's going around. And I'm sure that this is part of the kind of I'm sure that's one of the elements of this story as well. But the main one you hear about is the furnace, the idea of the furnaces.
Okay. All right. Okay. Also in the Q&A, Paul raises a question about a kind of intellectual immune deficiency syndrome, and he asks, doesn't the victimhood cult need to protect itself by denying students the critical tools they need to recognize that they are the victims of a hoax? Is that not why critical thinking is not part of the academic program any longer?
Yes.
Is that going on?
Well, I think definitely the neo-tribal elites who kind of, are the ones who are benefiting from the system. So in terms of, for example, Indigenous people, ordinary Indigenous people are not the ones that benefit from Indigenous studies programs and Indigenization. And if you did instill critical thinking in the students, they would realize that this is not something that is beneficial to them intellectually, or for those students who, I'm sure there are many Indigenous students who kind of see what they want to do is get an education, and then they want to go back to their communities to assist their communities. I've heard that quite often. And the kind of things that is being taught in these Indigenous studies programs are not going to assist in this process at all.
Yeah, I've had some experience in African schools, and I vividly remember one incident where a student was visiting a local research farm, and it was part of the agricultural program. And one of the students asked, what do you do to become a researcher? The student had very strong ambitions to become a researcher, and his own teacher told him, well, that's not really a goal that you can have, and this feeds back to this thing that I mentioned, or that we mentioned a little while ago, that maybe the pushback is going to come from students who realize before they ever get there, that get to universities, that no, this is what I want, and I'm going to insist that you provide that. When you've dealt with students, do you see the similar disconnect between the ambitions of students and what their faculty are telling them that they are capable of?
It's been a while since I've been in the classroom. My last year I was on sabbatical, and then last semester I taught was fall 2021. I know, just talking from Jonah Pickle, who's the student who is mounting the charter challenge. So he's a very good person to talk to, because he talks to a lot of students. And I used to, when I was teaching, there would be a certain segment of students who would be quite upset about the fact that they wanted to voice their concerns, yet they were afraid that they would be punished in terms of marks and so on for saying things. They felt very constrained, and Jonah was mentioning this situation with a lot of his the students that he talks to. But unfortunately, a lot of students, they're there for the credential, and the smart ones are going to figure out that, hey, how I'm just going to take these kind of courses that don't value merit. I'm just going to figure out what the professor, what their ideological leanings are, and then I'm just going to write things that are going to appeal to the particular political perspective of the professor. So I think that is kind of one of the sad things, that the whole sort of seeing universities as kind of training grounds for careers and so on, when this is part of our humanity here. Like we should, all of us, support universities in terms of the opportunity to go and find things out, our natural curiosity, which I think is just part of being human. And then all these sorts of careerist, marks-oriented types of things that go on in universities is very sad. But I think that's probably a lot is what is happening, is that students have just figured it out and are now just trying to get along and get their degree as the best way that they can.
Yeah. One person, I'm just scrolling up to find this comment. Yes, Vicky Galbraith mentions that in the late 1980s, she was at an Ontario university when the Philippe Rushton controversy happened. It was very scary. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about the Philippe Rushton incident.
Yeah. So I'm very familiar with the Philippe Rushton case. And I believe the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship was very involved in that case. And that's why there's a lot of professors from London, Ontario, which is the University of Western Ontario. Anyway, Philippe Rushton wrote a book, which basically, it wasn't even his own research. It was a summary of basically the field, and came up with an unpopular conclusion after doing a survey of this, that there were, and this is not talking about individuals, it's just talking about aggregate, and this is what people don't really understand. And I even remember being on a panel with a professor by the name of Ronaldo Walcott, where I was just making the argument at the time that, is this true? Is this true or false? And we need to be able to examine this, whether it's true or not. Like, that's different from the kind of policy implications or whatever you're going to be talking about. Anyway, Ronaldo said to me, "You're saying that the Negro sitting next to you is really dumb." I said, "Oh, that's not what this is about. It's not about individuals. It's about groups." Anyway, I'm not an expert in the area, so I don't know, the truth or the falsity, but I do know that it's an academic question that should be subjected to the same kinds of scrutiny and debates that go on with all other academic subjects. But what happened in the case of Rushton is that no one at Western would debate him on his research. And what they did is they had David Suzuki, who is a celebrity. He's actually a geneticist who studies fruit flies. That's not even his area of research. Anyway, he felt called upon to come and share the same air as Philippe Rushton. And it was really an embarrassment in terms of Suzuki, because Suzuki's spent the whole time basically grandstanding and saying, "I can't believe that I have to come out and lower myself to come here and share the same stage as Philippe Rushton," and it was very, very insulting to Philippe Rushton and the whole thing. But the one thing about that time is that there was enough of an intellectual culture that existed at the University of Western Ontario, where the university actually hosted this discussion. People were able to answer questions and so on. And you would not be able to have that at all today. That would not be possible today. And I believe the government kind of investigated, having him charged under some kind of hate speech type of legislation. Fortunately, they did not pursue that type of action. But Rushton, suffered a great deal throughout his career for his stance. And I know his ex-wife, Elizabeth Weiss, who is his ex-wife, and she said that Rushton was not a racist. He didn't have any problems with same-sex marriage. He just thought that this was an academic question that should be examined academically like any other. And you can't say in the academic setting that you can study this as long as you come up with the right answer. That kind of mentality is toxic to the academic setting. And just because you have some kind of finding, it says nothing about what you should do as a society about that finding. So I find it very troubling that people say that because we're worried about how these results might be interpreted, we have to stop the researchers from investigating these questions. And we're seeing that in a lot of different kinds of areas today. So I think it was a bit of a warning. It did hold firm at the time. The event was able to go happen, but the whole kind of response, I think, made people very gun shy about these very, very sensitive kind of research topics that as academics, we should be able to discuss and debate and investigate. That's basically what academic freedom is designed to protect.
Should be. Well, time does march on, and we're approaching the end of our time here. So before we close, let me just apologize to the people whose questions we did not mention today. We're sorry. I'm sorry we didn't get to your question, but we hope that what we did was interesting to you. If we didn't get to your question, please do feel free to send them along to me at my email address here at the NAS. That is turner@nas.org, and I'll do my best to pass your questions on to Frances so that she can respond. I'd also just like to remind everyone that our conversation today will be posted on our YouTube channel, and everyone who registered today for this event will get a link in your email. And you can also post questions in the comments section of that video, and we do monitor the comments, and we'll try to respond to questions there as well. And of course, by all means, when you get the link to the video, please share the link with your friends and colleagues. I'd also like to bring to your attention our guest next week on Restoring the Sciences will actually be Elizabeth Weiss. And she's been embroiled in her own controversies over indigenization, and hers, of course, over Native American archaeology and access to museum specimens. And we're going to be discussing the topic, can we save archaeology? And I've posted a link in the chat box. And someone mentioned that it's difficult to post those links or to copy those links from the chat box. I'm not sure if that's been resolved, but in any event, I'll put those links on the comment section of the YouTube video. And finally, a reminder that this event is sponsored by the National Association of Scholars. And if you're already a member, thank you for your generous support. And if you're not a member, please consider joining us. We're a fun group. And before I ask you for last words or final thoughts, Frances, I just want to close with a comment from Joseph. And he says, when you started your academic career, did you anticipate in any way that such awful developments would happen to you? So, Frances, thanks for joining us. Do you have any final thoughts?
In terms of my feeling that something awful, I didn't actually. I spent well, Albert Howard and I, when we met in the 90s, we've never had an easy time of it, and we pretty much made the same argument since that period. It's just that the climate has changed so much. So and even up until about 2020, I really thought that things were, although not great, reason would prevail, and if you're working in an academic institution, all you needed to do was just kind of make the case, more articulately and provide more evidence to support it. So I'm quite surprised at how things have fallen apart so quickly, and it's to some extent due to tipping points, I guess, is that things are not just on a linear thing. They reach a kind of a critical moment. But I think that in terms of my personality, I'm well situated to, draw attention to the circumstances. And that's, even if I am unsuccessful in my efforts, I hope to show the next generation how things went wrong, and what sort of the warning signs are when the academic character of institutions is just about to fall apart.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you, Frances, for joining us today. It was a fascinating discussion, and I always like to end this with an optimistic note, and thank you, even if it's in the far distant that we're going to see a turnaround here, but we can always hope for the best. So, Frances Widdowson, thank you very much for joining us today, and good luck in your future efforts.
Thank you very much.
Okay, goodbye, everyone.